I'm Dr. Ian Clary, and I'm joined with Dr. Brad Littlejohn, and we're having a discussion about COVID, lockdowns, responsibilities of churches to governments, and now we're going to talk a little bit about the responsibility of governments to churches. So, question that I think a lot of people are really asking right now is, how should churches be treated in the midst of all of this? Where we're getting language of essential versus not essential. How do we work that out?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing to be said is that civil authorities have not done themselves any favors by the language they've used for this. And in terms of labeling businesses essential and non-essential, and then telling churches, well, you fall in the category of non-essential, but the liquor store falls in the category of essential. That's gonna provoke an understandable backlash that opens itself up to all kinds of easy memes and attacks and questions.
And in my home country, there's a common picture you'll see on people's Facebooks where it'll be a red strip at the bottom and it'll say church is more than essential, which I appreciate the impulse behind, but I don't think that they're quite getting it.
Right. That said, I don't necessarily have a better idea off the top of my own head as to exactly what language should be used. But I think we do need to, first of all, start with understanding the restrictions that are being made. They should really be based on two considerations the government should be asking of any given business gathering activity. Right. Question one is, how likely is this sort of activity to transmit the virus, and how easily can it be adjusted in ways that don't transmit the virus? And question two is, what would be the social consequences of banning this activity, right? How feasible is it to ban the activity? So how dangerous is the activity and how feasible is it to ban the activity, right? And Christians need to be honest with themselves that church services are going to be one of the most dangerous activities that you can come up with, because the whole purpose is gathering together as a community. It's interesting. The defenses of why churches need to gather for worship are in some ways highlighting exactly why they haven't been allowed to, right? It's like, the body of Christ is supposed to be relational. And, sure enough, I've seen church services that really tried to maintain social distancing during the service. And then at the end of the service, people gathered around and talked closely to each other and shook hands and hugged and so on. And, people don't do that at Walmart, there's a reason why Walmart can, from that standpoint alone, there's just a reason why it's less dangerous for Walmart to stay open than for churches to stay open. And of course the services themselves, you're speaking, you're singing. Singing is known to be particularly risky. So, so there's a very legitimate reason for civil authorities to treat churches with a considerable degree of caution relative to other activities that are just objectively much lower risk. Now, that said, you have to ask the question of, okay, one, how dangerous is it? Two, how feasible is it to restrict it, or rather perhaps what are the harms that would come from restricting this activity? That's where something like, why are liquor stores still open? Well, it's part of the reason why, we tried prohibiting liquor sales altogether in the US from 1919 to 1933. And we realized that was a disastrous idea because liquor still got sold, just in much more dangerous and unregulated ways. So presumably liquor stores are still open in the pandemic because they're afraid of what would happen if people were trying to get alcohol by illicit means. But what that highlights is that you have to ask yourself, what is the harm that's going to come from trying to close down this kind of activity? And I think there is a real genuine concern that our civil authorities are pretty oblivious to the harm that is done from shutting down churches. That, what harm could there be really? It's just a sort of private hobby. Some people want to go to the movie on Sunday. Some people want to go to brunch. Some people want to go and have their worship experience. And you can watch a movie streaming online. You can get a brunch takeout why can't you just get your spiritual fix, through a Zoom service, right? It's clear that there's a lot of that kind of attitude. And it's clear that that attitude has provoked many Christians to react against these restrictions, realizing that the seriousness of worship is not taken seriously by many of our governing authorities. And there probably are some cases, indeed. I think this is probably exaggerated, but there probably are some cases in which there are leaders who are actively hostile to the church and see this as an opportunity to stick it to them. I think more often than not, it's just kind of neglect, apathy, that rather than opposition.
Not really a tyranny then.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think tyranny, tyranny is a slippery word, but you can have something that's effectively tyranny just by virtue of, without there being a sort of outright hostility. So, I think, and it's impossible to generalize. There are definitely places in which churches are receiving quite preferential treatment in the U.S. They've been allowed to be open where other things haven't, despite the fact that they're higher risk activities. There are some places in which, at least I haven't encountered it personally, but I've heard from people saying, that, like movie theaters are being allowed to gather, or casinos, or strip clubs, or but churches aren't, and it becomes difficult. It seems like this is no higher risk of a church is not a higher risk activity, and it's a much more important activity. So I think when we get to questions of resisting unjust commands, then we can look at these questions of how are churches being treated relative to other entities. And I think it does differ very much on a case-by-case, location-by-location basis. But we also need to recognize that some differential treatment, churches going online when Walmart is still open, is not saying that Walmart is more important than the church. But it's saying what the church has always said, which is that Hooker has a good line: to live well, you have to first live, right? Like the church, a grocery store is in some sense more important than church, because without a grocery store, church would be empty pretty quick, right? So there are things that are genuinely essential in that sense of keeping the kind of physical wheels of our society turning, and that we do have to keep going even when the church may have to temporarily cease its activities, without that denigrating the work of the church. So I think it's a delicate balance, and I think it's very true that in our post-Christian society, our leaders are not well positioned to draw those distinctions well. But I think we as churches in some ways need to try and supply the gaps in their reasoning for them.
So you just said something that I was going to ask you about then. Is it ever okay for governments to refrain in-person worship of the churches within its domain?
Yeah, I mean, more generally, can anyone, does anyone have the authority to call a halt to in-person worship? And the argument has been made by some, no. I mean, the obligation to worship, to gather for worship on the first day of the week now was the seventh day, but the Sabbath command presents the obligation to gather once a week for worship as a exceptionless command. The church has to gather once a week for worship, and if it doesn't, it's disobeying God. And that's where, if indeed it's flatly disobeying God, then it doesn't matter what the civil magistrate says. Civil magistrate can't command in a way that overrides God's command. So they're asking the right question. If indeed God commands it in an exceptionless way, then that solves it. But does he? Well, the churches that are saying this don't themselves actually believe it, because if you look at it, most of them say, well, we did call a halt to services during the first lockdown, because, for whatever, they get loving our neighbor, or we didn't know how bad the virus was, or whatever. Well, therefore you granted it wasn't an exceptionalist norm, that you thought that there were some circumstances under which it was legitimate to abstain from public worship. For whatever reason, you just don't think that is the case now. And they will say, you don't have to come back. We were still making online worship available for those not willing to come back. well, is that saying we are allowing some of our people to continue in sin? Well, no, they're acknowledging that some people might have legitimate reasons for not gathering. When there's a blizzard, most churches would cancel services, right? If the church had a pipe break and, on Saturday night and then there was water everywhere, they would call off services. If the church didn't, then the local civil magistrate might, if there was something about a building that made it unsafe for occupancy, the civil magistrate could say, whoa, sorry, can't gather for worship this Sunday. So there are obviously circumstances in which we recognize that we're allowed to violate the ordinary command of gathering on a weekly basis. Now, how do we think about that? Well, I think it's quite simple, which is there's an asymmetry between God's prohibitions and his commands. When God says, don't do something, thou shalt not, well, then anytime you do it, by definition, you're violating the command. But when God says, thou shalt do something, well, by definition, he doesn't mean thou shalt do it at all times, continuously. Even pray without ceasing doesn't literally mean without ceasing, because you do have to do other things. So all of God's positive commands are, thou shalt do this when you are able to. When you're able to, within the network of all the other things thou shalt do. There are many things you should do, and you sometimes can't do one because of another. And therefore, if the government says, do this thing that God has forbidden, well then, boom, obviously disobey the government, obey God, right?
Right.
But if the government says, don't do this thing that God has commanded, you have to say, well, God has commanded us to do it, but obviously that doesn't mean we can do it at all times. And is this one of those times when we cannot do it? This may be one of those times when we cannot do it. And then you're not disobeying God to obey men. So I think just some basic prudence here in thinking through the logic of God's commands and the ways in which we recognize exceptions to them on an everyday basis can help us from creating a sort of categorical conflict where there doesn't need to be one. Then that doesn't mean that every time the government says shut down, you shut down, right? It's just saying it's not automatically wrong. It's at least in principle valid to have that sort of restriction.
Yeah, it's you're trying to give Christians and pastors and churches categories by which to understand what it is that we can, halt a worship service when we can't, and why, if we have to, or if we choose to under certain conditions, we're not violating the whole commandment. So I think those distinctions that you make are really helpful. And I hope that people actually sat and just listened and are wanting to think through that, because I think that's very key. So now we've considered the government's, ways the government should be treating Christians and treating churches specifically, and we've looked at whether or not it's okay to refrain from worship under certain conditions, and so we'll come back in the next segment and we'll be looking at how this thing kind of works itself out practically. Thank you.
Thank you.